I didn't argue when she said it. I didn't even raise my voice. I just looked at my son and realized I had already lost him long before that night. Now that Dad is gone, you need to pack your things and leave, Vanessa said, her tone calm, almost polite, like she was asking me to pass the salt across the table, not telling me to walk away from the home I had lived in for over 30 years, and Daniel. My Daniel, the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who once cried when I left him at kindergarten, just sat there, staring down at his plate as if the pattern on the china was more important than the words hanging in the air. Between us, the dining room felt wrong without Thomas, the silence heavier than it had been even the day after the funeral, his chair still pulled out slightly from the table as if he might return at any moment, his reading glasses resting neatly beside his plate where I had forgotten to move them. Everything in that room still carried him, except the people sitting across from me. You can't expect to stay here alone, Vanessa continued, folding her napkin with precise, careful movements. This house is too much for you, and honestly, it makes more sense for us to take over now. I remember how steady her voice was, how reasonable she sounded, as if this had already been decided somewhere I hadn't been invited to. I turned to Daniel, waiting, hoping for something, anything, a word, a protest, even hesitation, but all I saw was a man avoiding his own reflection in his mother's eyes. It's just practical, Mom, he said quietly, still not looking at me, and in that moment something inside me didn't shatter, it didn't explode, it simply went still, like a lake freezing over in the middle of winter. I nodded once, slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood that this wasn't about practicality. It wasn't about the size of the house or the cost of the utilities or whether I could manage the stairs. This was about erasing me, about turning me into a temporary guest in a life I had built from the ground up. I pushed my chair back gently, the legs barely making a sound against the hardwood floor Thomas had refinished himself 10 years ago. All right, I said, my voice quieter than I expected, but steady, always steady. Vanessa blinked, just for a second, as if she had prepared for resistance, for tears, for a scene she could later describe as me being difficult. But I gave her none of that. I stood, smoothing the front of my cardigan, the same pale gray one Thomas used to say made me look elegant, and I noticed how neither of them moved. Neither of them reached out. Neither of them tried to stop me as I walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, and into the bedroom that still smelled faintly of his cologne. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the brass doorknob, listening to the muffled clink of dishes being cleared downstairs, as if nothing significant had just happened, as if a lifetime hadn't just been reduced to a conversation over dinner. The room looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, before the funeral, before the condolences, before the quiet shift I hadn't wanted to see. Thomas's side of the bed still slightly indented, his watch resting on the nightstand. The book he had been reading left open, face down, marking a page he would never finish. I walked over slowly and picked it up, running my fingers along the edge of the paper. And for a moment, just a moment, the grief tried to rise again, thick and overwhelming. But something else held it back, something colder, clearer. I set the book down carefully and opened the closet, pulling out a small suitcase, not the large one we used for vacations, not the one filled with memories of road trips and hotel rooms and laughter, just a simple carry-on, enough for a few days, because I knew I wouldn't need much, not yet. I folded a few clothes, moving with quiet precision, each action deliberate, controlled, as if I were following instructions only I could hear. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa's voice again, lighter now, almost cheerful, and Daniel responding in that same muted tone, and it struck me then, not with pain, but with clarity. They thought this was over. They thought they had already won. I zipped the suitcase closed and placed it by the door, then walked back to the nightstand, my eyes resting on something I had almost forgotten, something Thomas had insisted on weeks before he passed, something I hadn't fully understood at the time. I didn't touch it yet, not tonight. Instead, I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness, and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded neatly in my lap, breathing slowly, steadily, like I had learned to do in moments that mattered. I wasn't thinking about where I would sleep tomorrow, or what people would say, or how humiliating it might look from the outside. I was thinking about Thomas, about the way he used to look at me when he knew something I didn't, about the quiet confidence in his voice when he said, "Trust me." And for the first time since he was gone, I felt that same certainty settle into my chest. They believed I was leaving because I had no choice. They believed I was stepping aside because I was weak, because I was alone, because I had no one left to stand beside me. But they were wrong, and I didn't need to tell them that. Not yet. I picked up my coat from the chair, slipped it on, and took one last look around the room, not with sadness, but with something closer to resolve. Then I lifted the suitcase and walked out without making a sound. And the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, before they had even finished their coffee, I went somewhere they never imagined I would go. I sat in the front seat of my car with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the early morning light stretch slowly across the empty parking lot, as if the world itself was waking up without urgency, without knowing that mine had shifted completely in less than 12 hours. I had left before they came downstairs, before the coffee maker started its familiar hum, before Vanessa could offer another calm, reasonable sentence about why it was better this way. I had closed the front door behind me without a sound, the same way I had walked out of that dining room, carrying only what I needed and leaving behind everything they thought I could not live without. The house stood quiet in my rearview mirror when I drove away, the porch light still on, casting that soft yellow glow Thomas had insisted on installing because he said a home should always look welcoming, even in the dark. I wondered if he would recognize it now, if he would feel the difference the way I did, not in the furniture or the walls, but in the absence of something that used to hold it all together. I drove for a while without turning on the radio, letting the silence fill the space around me. The roads were nearly empty, just a few early commuters and delivery trucks, the kind of ordinary morning that would have once felt comforting, predictable, safe. But now it felt like a stage where everything looked the same even though nothing was. I did not cry, not because I was not hurting, but because the kind of pain I felt did not come with tears. It came with a strange clarity, a stillness that settled deep in my chest and refused to move, as if my mind had decided that there would be time for grief later. But now was not that time. Now was for understanding, for remembering, for paying attention. I replayed the past few weeks in my head, the small things I had dismissed at the time, the way Vanessa had started speaking in plans instead of questions, the way Daniel had begun using words like practical and efficient when talking about the house, the way conversations would stop when I entered the room, followed by polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I had told myself it was stress, that grief made people act differently, that everyone was trying to find their footing after losing Thomas. But sitting there in that quiet parking lot, I saw it for what it had been, a slow shift, carefully measured, leading to that single sentence at the dinner table. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of the envelope I had placed there before leaving the bedroom. I had almost forgotten about it in the moment, but something had pulled my attention back, something about the way Thomas had looked at me that evening weeks ago when he handed it to me and said, "Keep this somewhere safe, just in case." I had laughed then, brushing it off as unnecessary, because we had always handled things together. There had never been a need for secrets or contingencies between us. But now, as I held it in my hands, I realized that Thomas had seen something I had chosen not to. I turned the envelope over slowly, tracing the familiar curve of his handwriting, my name written in a way that felt both ordinary and deeply personal. I did not open it yet, not in the car, not in that moment. Instead, I placed it back into my pocket, letting it rest there like a quiet promise. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building in front of me, the glass doors reflecting a version of myself I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, but because something in my posture had changed, something steadier, more deliberate. Inside, the air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that comes from routine, from people who arrive at the same time every day and follow the same patterns without question. The receptionist looked up briefly as I entered, offering a polite smile that did not linger. I returned it with a nod and continued down the hallway, my footsteps soft against the polished floor. I knew exactly where I was going. Even though I had not been here in years, the door at the end of the corridor was the same, the name on the frosted glass unchanged, and for a moment, I paused, my hand hovering just above the handle, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was the place Thomas had come to when he needed things to be certain. When he wanted to make sure that what mattered to him would be protected, I took a slow breath, then opened the door and stepped inside. The office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the desk neatly arranged, the shelves lined with files that told stories no one outside these walls would ever hear. And as I stood there, waiting, I realized something that settled into me with the same quiet certainty as everything else that morning. They believed they had taken my place. They believed they had decided my future, but they had only acted on what they could see, and they had never understood what Thomas had built beneath the surface. I folded my hands in front of me, standing tall, patient, composed, because for the first time since that dinner, I was not reacting to what had been done to me. I was stepping into something that had already been set in motion long before they ever thought to push me out. The man behind the desk did not look surprised to see me, which in itself told me more than any greeting could have. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and offered a quiet nod as if my arrival had been expected all along. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice steady and measured, "I am very sorry for your loss." I thanked him with the same calm tone I had used since the night before, not out of politeness alone, but because it was the only way I could keep everything else in place. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, placing my hands neatly in my lap, the envelope still resting in my coat pocket, its presence both grounding and unsettling at the same time. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence in the room felt different from the silence at home. It was not heavy or cold. It was structured, purposeful, like the pause before something important was said. "Your husband came to see me several times over the past year," he began, opening a folder on his desk with careful precision. He wanted to make sure that everything was arranged exactly the way he intended. I listened without interrupting, my eyes following the movement of his hands as he turned each page, each document placed in front of him with a level of care that suggested nothing here had been left to chance. He was very clear about one thing. The lawyer continued, glancing up at me briefly. "He did not want you to be placed in a vulnerable position, no matter what happened." The words settled into me slowly, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something I had begun to feel in the quiet moments since leaving the house. Thomas had known, not in a vague or fearful way, but in a precise, deliberate way, the kind that led a man to prepare, to put things in writing, to ensure that what he could no longer protect in person would still be protected in his absence. I reached into my pocket and placed the envelope on the desk, sliding it gently toward him. "He asked me to keep this," I said, my voice even. The lawyer nodded, as if he had expected that as well, opening it with care and scanning its contents before placing it beside the other documents. "Yes," he said softly. "This is part of it." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "There are provisions in your husband's estate that have not yet been discussed with your son or his wife." I felt a subtle shift in the air, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, like the first sign of a tide beginning to turn. "What kind of provisions?" I asked, not because I doubted, but because I needed to hear it spoken aloud, to understand the shape of what had been set in motion. "The house," he said simply, "and your right to remain in it, under all circumstances." I held his gaze, waiting for him to continue. "Your husband established a living trust several months ago," he explained. "The property was transferred into that trust, and you are the primary beneficiary with full residential rights, meaning no one can legally remove you from that home, regardless of what anyone else might believe." The words did not hit me like a revelation. They settled into place like pieces of a puzzle finally aligning. Everything Vanessa had said, everything Daniel had failed to say, all of it built on an assumption that had never actually been true. "There is more," he added, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that made me straighten slightly in my chair. "Your husband included a clause regarding coercion or undue pressure." I felt my fingers tighten just slightly against my lap, not out of fear, but out of recognition. "If any party attempts to force you out of the residence or manipulate your position within the estate, their share of certain assets can be significantly reduced or reassigned." The room remained quiet after he finished speaking, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was sharper now, clearer, like the moment after a truth has been laid out and cannot be taken back. I thought about the dinner table, about Vanessa's calm voice, about Daniel's silence, about the way they had both assumed that I would accept what they told me as fact. I thought about how easily I had walked away, how willingly I had allowed them to believe that their version of reality was the only one that mattered. There will be a formal meeting, the lawyer continued, to review the estate in full, including these provisions. I nodded once, slowly, my mind already moving ahead, not in panic, not in anger, but in a quiet, steady calculation that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely natural at the same time. When? I asked. 3 days from now, he replied. Your son and his wife will be present. 3 days, I repeated the number in my head, not as a countdown, but as a space, a pause between what had already happened and what was about to unfold. I stood, smoothing my coat once more, the same small gesture I had made the night before, but it felt different now, not like I was holding myself together, but like I was preparing. Thank you, I said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that no longer felt forced. He inclined his head in return, as if acknowledging something unspoken between us, something that did not need to be explained. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps measured, controlled, the same way they had been when I left the house. But this time, there was no sense of being pushed out, no feeling of loss following behind me. Instead, there was a quiet awareness that what I had walked away from was not mine to lose in the way they believed, and what I was walking toward had already been secured long before any of us sat down at that table. Outside, the air felt different against my skin, cooler, sharper. I paused for a moment beside my car, looking up at the pale morning sky, and for the first time since Thomas was gone, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath of something that was not grief, not relief, but something in between, something steady, something patient, because now I understood what he had meant when he told me to trust him, and more importantly, I understood what I needed to do next. I would not call Daniel. I would not return to the house. I would not correct Vanessa's assumptions or explain anything that might give them time to adjust. I would let them continue exactly as they were, confident, certain, already dividing a future they did not yet have. And when we sat down together again in that room in 3 days, I would not need to raise my voice. I would not need to argue or defend myself. I would simply be there, with the truth already in place, waiting for them to hear it for the first time. That afternoon, I checked into a small extended-stay hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place people pass without noticing, with neutral walls, quiet hallways, and a front desk clerk who did not ask unnecessary questions. The room was simple. A bed, a small kitchenette, a single armchair by the window, nothing that carried history, nothing that carried Thomas, and for the first time since everything had shifted, I allowed myself to sit down without thinking about what came next. I placed my suitcase near the dresser and hung my coat carefully in the closet, the same way I had always done at home, not out of habit alone, but because it reminded me that I still had control over small things, over how I moved, how I arranged my space, how I chose to exist in a place that was not meant to feel permanent. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, a few cars scattered under the pale afternoon light, people coming and going with quiet routines, and I realized how ordinary everything still looked from the outside, how no one could see that my life had been divided into before and after in a single conversation. I sat in the armchair and folded my hands in my lap, the envelope now resting on the small table beside me. Already opened, already understood, but still carrying a weight that I could feel even without touching it. My mind drifted back, not to the dinner table, not to Vanessa's voice or Daniel's silence, but further back, to a different evening. Years ago, when Thomas and I had been sitting in the backyard just after sunset, the air warm, the smell of freshly cut grass still lingering. He had been unusually quiet that night, not distant, but thoughtful. The kind of quiet that comes when someone is deciding whether to say something that might change how things are seen. I remember asking him if something was wrong, and he had smiled, that soft, steady smile that always made me feel like everything would be fine. Nothing is wrong, he said. I just want to make sure you will be all right, no matter what happens. I had laughed lightly then, brushing it aside, telling him that we had always been all right, that we had built everything together and would continue to do so. But he had not laughed with me. Instead, he reached over and took my hand, holding it with a firmness that felt different from his usual warmth. Evelyn, he said, looking at me in a way that made me pay attention even if I did not fully understand why. Sometimes people change when circumstances change, and I need to know that you will not let anyone push you out of what is yours. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, perhaps even a little dramatic. We had raised Daniel to be kind, responsible, respectful. We had welcomed Vanessa into our family, given her a place at our table, trusted her with our traditions, our home, our lives. It had never occurred to me that there would come a day when I would need to defend my place among them. But now, sitting in that quiet hotel room, I could hear his voice clearly, not as a memory, but as something that had been waiting for me to catch up to it. I stood and walked slowly around the room, letting my fingers brush lightly against the surfaces, the smooth edge of the dresser, the cool metal of the kitchenette sink, grounding myself in the present while carrying the past with me in a way that no longer felt overwhelming. I thought about Daniel as a child, the way he used to run into the house after school, dropping his backpack by the door, calling out for me before he even saw me, the way he would sit at the kitchen counter while I cooked, telling me about his day in a stream of words that never seemed to end. I thought about the nights Thomas and I spent talking about his future, about how we wanted him to grow into someone who valued family, who understood loyalty, who would never forget where he came from. And for a moment, a brief, quiet moment, something like sadness moved through me, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present, because the man who had sat at that table the night before had not been the boy we raised. And yet, I realized, he had not become someone else. Overnight, the change had been gradual, shaped by choices, by influence, by the quiet permission he had given himself to step back when he should have stepped forward. I returned to the chair and sat down again, my posture straight, my breathing even, the sadness settling into something more stable, something that did not need to be pushed away or hidden. I did not need to decide what Daniel deserved or what Vanessa intended. I did not need to understand every detail of how things had come to this point. What mattered was what I would do next, and for the first time, that question did not feel overwhelming. It felt clear. I would wait, I would watch, I would allow them to continue exactly as they had been, confident, certain, unaware of what had already been put in place. I would not return to the house before the meeting. I would not call. I would not explain. I would not give them the chance to adjust their expectations or soften their approach. I would let them stand exactly where they believed they stood, because only then would they truly understand the distance between what they thought was true and what actually was. I reached over and turned off the lamp beside me, letting the room fall into a soft, even darkness, not the heavy darkness of loss, but something quieter, more controlled. And as I lay down on the bed, the unfamiliar mattress firm beneath me, I closed my eyes without resistance, without replaying the past again and again, because I no longer needed to search for meaning in what had already happened. I had found it, not in their actions, but in Thomas's foresight, in his quiet determination to protect what we had built, and in my own ability to finally see it clearly. And as sleep began to settle over me, steady and uninterrupted, I understood something with a certainty that felt stronger than anything I had felt in days. I had not been cast out of my life. I had stepped aside, just long enough for the truth to reveal itself exactly where it needed to be. The next morning began the same way the last one had ended, quietly, without urgency, without anyone waiting for me or expecting me to explain where I had been. I woke before the alarm I had set out of habit rather than necessity, the pale light filtering through the thin curtains of the hotel room, casting soft shadows across the unfamiliar walls. And for a moment, just a moment, I forgot where I was. I expected to hear the low hum of the coffee machine downstairs, the faint creak of the hallway floorboards, Thomas moving through the house in that steady, predictable rhythm that had once defined the beginning of every day. But instead there was only silence, not heavy, not empty, just different. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the carpet, letting the reality of where I was settle into me without resistance. I did not reach for my phone. I did not check for messages that I already knew would not come, because if Daniel had thought about calling, he would have done it the night before, and if Vanessa had, it would not have been out of concern. I moved through the small routine I had created for myself, making coffee in the kitchenette, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring the water with steady hands, watching the steam rise in thin, quiet lines, the kind of small, controlled actions that made everything else feel more manageable. I carried the cup to the window and stood there, looking out at the same parking lot I had seen the day before. A few more cars now. People beginning their day, unaware of how easily something solid could be taken apart. I thought about what they might be doing at that exact moment. Vanessa likely moving through the house with a sense of ownership that had come too quickly, opening cabinets, making plans, adjusting things to fit her preferences. Daniel following behind her in that quiet way he had adopted, agreeing, adapting, allowing. I imagined them sitting at the same dining table, discussing what would happen next, perhaps already talking about renovations, about how to use the extra space, about what to do with the rooms that had once belonged to Thomas and me, and the thought did not sting the way it might have before. It simply settled into place as another piece of understanding. I took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth steady me, and then I set the cup down and reached for my bag. Pulling out a small notebook I had not used in years, I opened it to the first blank page and sat at the small table, pen in hand, and began to write, not out of emotion, not as a way to release anything, but as a way to organize, to see things clearly in front of me. I wrote down what I knew, the details the lawyer had given me, the structure of the trust, the clause about coercion, the timeline of the meeting, and then I wrote down what I had observed, the changes in behavior, the conversation at dinner, the certainty in Vanessa's voice, the absence in Daniel's. I did not rush. I did not skip over anything. I let each detail take its place, because for the first time, I understood that clarity was not something that appeared all at once. It was something built, piece by piece, through attention and patience. When I finished, I closed the notebook and rested my hand on top of it, feeling a quiet sense of control that had nothing to do with the house, nothing to do with the money, but everything to do with how I was choosing to move forward. I spent the rest of the morning in that same deliberate rhythm. I took a short walk around the block, noting the small details of the neighborhood, the sound of a dog barking in the distance, the smell of someone cooking breakfast, the steady flow of traffic on the main road, all of it grounding me in a world that had not changed, even if mine had. And when I returned to the room, I sat again by the window, my thoughts moving not toward what I had lost, but toward what was coming. The meeting in 3 days was no longer something I approached with uncertainty. It had become a fixed point, something I could prepare for, something I could step into without hesitation. I considered whether I should reach out to Daniel, whether I should give him the chance to say something, to explain, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I realized that any conversation now would not be honest. It would be shaped by what he thought I knew, by what Vanessa would allow, by what they both needed to maintain their sense of control, and I did not need that. I did not need explanations or apologies that came too late. What I needed was to let things unfold exactly as they were meant to, without interference, without warning. I stood and walked back to the small table, picking up the envelope once more, not to read it again, but simply to hold it, to feel the weight of the decision Thomas had made, the quiet certainty he had carried when he chose to prepare for a moment like this. I placed it back carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small, precise movement that mirrored the larger one I was making in my life. And as the afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the room, I felt something settle into place within me, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady, growing understanding. I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was no longer standing in the space they had pushed me into. I had stepped outside of it, into something they had not anticipated, something they had not prepared for, and I would remain there, calm, patient, and ready, until the moment came when everything they believed would be placed directly in front of the truth they had chosen to ignore. By the second evening, the silence had begun to feel less like an absence and more like a space I could shape. I no longer reached for sounds that were not there. I no longer expected the rhythm of the house to return to what it had been. Instead, I moved through my hours with a quiet awareness that everything now depended on what I chose to notice and what I chose to ignore. I had not heard from Daniel, not a message, not a missed call, not even a brief attempt to check if I had arrived somewhere safely. And that absence spoke more clearly than anything he could have said. It told me that whatever conversation had taken place after I left had settled quickly into a version of events that did not include concern, only resolution. I imagined Vanessa standing in the kitchen, her voice steady, explaining that this was necessary, that it was for the best, that I had agreed without resistance. And Daniel accepting that version because it required nothing from him, no confrontation, no discomfort, just a quiet step forward into a future that had already been arranged for him. I sat at the small table again, the notebook open in front of me, and added a few more lines, not because I needed more information, but because I needed to see the pattern clearly. I wrote down the timing, the shift in tone after Thomas passed, the way Vanessa had taken control of conversations, the way Daniel had withdrawn, the way decisions had been presented as conclusions rather than discussions. I paused for a moment, the pen resting lightly against the paper, and then I added one more line, something I had not wanted to admit before. They had not expected me to question anything. They had expected me to accept, to adjust, to disappear quietly into whatever space they decided was appropriate. And that expectation had been their greatest mistake, not because I would confront them directly, not because I would argue or demand, but because they had underestimated what it meant for me to remain silent. I closed the notebook and set it aside, then reached for my phone, turning it over in my hand without unlocking it. I considered again whether there was anything I needed to say before the meeting, any message that might change the way things unfolded, but each time the thought formed, it dissolved just as quickly, because I understood now that anything said too early would only give them time to adjust, to prepare, to reshape their approach in a way that might soften the moment that was coming, and I did not want that, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The truth had been arranged in a way that required no explanation from me. It would speak for itself when the time came. I placed the phone back on the table and stood, walking slowly to the window, the sky outside beginning to darken, the lights in the parking lot flickering on one by one, casting small circles of yellow against the pavement. I watched as a couple walked toward their car, speaking quietly, their movements familiar, unguarded, and for a brief moment, I thought about what it meant to share a life with someone who understood you without the need for words, and how rare that truly was. Thomas had understood me in ways I had not fully appreciated until now, not just in the way he spoke or the way he listened, but in the way he prepared, in the way he anticipated what might happen and chose to act before it did. I turned away from the window and walked back to the bed, sitting down with the same steady posture I had carried since leaving the house. I was not waiting in the way I once would have, counting hours, anticipating outcomes, hoping for things to change. I was holding my position, allowing time to move forward without trying to shape it prematurely, because for the first time, I understood that patience was not passive. It was deliberate. It was an active choice to let events unfold in a way that revealed their true form. I lay back against the pillow, my hands resting lightly at my sides, and closed my eyes, not to escape, but to rest within that stillness, to let my thoughts settle into something clear and focused. The meeting was now only 2 days away, and with each passing hour, the distance between what they believed and what was actually true grew wider, not because anything new was being added, but because they continued to move forward based on assumptions that had never been real, and I allowed that distance to remain. I did not reach out to correct it. I did not step in to narrow it, because it was within that space that everything would become visible, everything they had overlooked, everything they had dismissed, everything they had taken for granted. And when that moment arrived, it would not require force or confrontation. It would not require raised voices or emotional appeals. It would simply require presence, and I was ready to be exactly that, present, composed, and certain, not of what they would say or how they would react, but of what had already been put in place long before any of us realized how necessary it would become. On the morning of the meeting, I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I was anxious, but because my body had already adjusted to a different kind of awareness, one that did not allow for hesitation or distraction. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, my hands resting lightly on my knees, and took a slow breath, steady and controlled, the room around me still, unchanged from the days before. Yet I felt something within me settle into place with a clarity that had not been there before. I stood and dressed with care, choosing simple, neutral clothing, the kind that did not draw attention but carried a quiet sense of intention. The same pale gray cardigan, pressed neatly, the same shoes I had worn countless times without thinking, But today, every detail felt deliberate, not as a statement to anyone else, but as a reflection of the steadiness I had found within myself. I did not rush. I did not check the time repeatedly. I moved through each step as if I had already rehearsed it, because in a way, I had. Not in action, but in thought. In the quiet hours where everything had been considered and set into place, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window one last time, looking out at the same parking lot that had become a temporary constant, and I realized that I no longer saw it as a place I was staying. I saw it as a place I had passed through, a space between what had been taken from me and what I was about to reclaim. I set the cup down, untouched, and reached for my coat, slipping it on with a small, practiced motion. Then I picked up my bag, making sure the envelope and the notebook were inside, not because I needed them for what was about to happen, but because they represented something I carried with me, something that had been placed in my hands long before I understood its purpose. The drive to the office felt shorter than it had days before, the roads more familiar, the turns more certain, and when I pulled into the parking lot, I did not sit in the car. As I had the first morning, I did not need that pause. I turned off the engine and stepped out immediately, closing the door with a quiet click that echoed slightly in the stillness of the early hour. Inside, the building was already awake, the receptionist offering the same polite smile, the same nod, and I returned it with the same calm acknowledgement, my steps measured as I walked down the hallway, each one steady, unhurried. I reached the conference room door and paused for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was the moment everything had been moving toward, not because of what had happened days ago, but because of what had been set in motion long before that. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was arranged simply, a long table, chairs placed evenly around it, documents neatly stacked at one end, and for a moment, it was empty, quiet, waiting. I took a seat near the middle, not at the head, not at the far end, just a place that allowed me to see everything clearly. I placed my bag beside my chair and folded my hands in my lap, my posture straight, my expression neutral, and I waited, not with impatience, not with anticipation, but with a calm certainty that did not need to be reinforced. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hallway, the sound distinct, familiar, and then the door opened. Vanessa entered first, her expression composed, her movements confident, followed closely by Daniel, his gaze shifting briefly before settling somewhere just past me, as if he could not decide where to look. Vanessa's eyes met mine, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Not fear, not yet, but a subtle adjustment, a recalibration of the expectations she had carried into the room. "You came," she said, her voice light, almost conversational, as if this were a casual meeting rather than the unfolding of something far more significant. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her without adding anything more, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Daniel took a seat across from me, his hands resting on the table, fingers interlaced, a gesture I recognized from years ago, something he did when he was trying to appear composed. Vanessa sat beside him, placing her bag neatly by her chair, her posture straight, controlled, the picture of someone who believed she understood the situation completely. And in that moment, I saw clearly the distance between what they believed and what was actually true, not as a dramatic realization, but as a simple, undeniable fact. The lawyer entered shortly after, carrying a folder, his presence grounding the room in a way that shifted the atmosphere slightly. He greeted each of us with the same measured tone, then took his seat at the head of the table, placing the folder down with care, and as he began to speak, outlining the purpose of the meeting, the structure of the estate, the documents that would be reviewed, I did not focus on the details he was repeating. I had already heard them, already understood them. Instead, I watched. I observed the subtle changes, the way Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her attention sharp, her confidence intact, the way Daniel remained still, listening, but not fully present, and I allowed myself to remain exactly where I was, composed, steady, and certain, because I knew that within the next few minutes, everything they believed would begin to shift, not through anything I would say, not through any action I would take, but through the simple act of the truth being placed in front of them, clearly, undeniably, and without room for interpretation. The lawyer's voice remained even as he began to read. each word placed carefully, deliberately, as if the weight of them required precision rather than emphasis. And for a moment, the room felt suspended in a quiet that was not empty but expectant. "The estate of Thomas Harper has been organized under a living trust," he said, glancing briefly at the documents before him, "with specific provisions regarding property, financial assets, and beneficiary rights." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Her attention sharpened, her posture still composed but more engaged now, as if she were aligning herself with what she believed would confirm everything she had already decided. Daniel remained still, his hands folded together, his gaze fixed somewhere near the center of the table, avoiding direct contact with anyone. I did not move. I did not shift my posture or adjust my expression. I simply listened, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was meant to. "The primary residential property," the lawyer continued, "has been transferred into the trust and is designated for the exclusive residential use of Mrs. Evelyn Harper." The words settled into the air with a clarity that did not need repetition, and for a brief second, no one spoke. Vanessa's expression did not change immediately, but there was a pause, a fraction of a second where her confidence did not advance forward as it had before. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, her voice still controlled, still measured, but now carrying a slight edge of precision that had not been there moments ago. The lawyer turned his attention to her, his tone unchanged. "It means that Mrs. Harper retains full legal right to reside in the property for the duration of her life, and that right cannot be revoked or overridden by any other party." Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Daniel shifted in his seat, his posture no longer as steady, his gaze lifting briefly before dropping again, as if the words had reached him but had not yet fully settled into understanding. "In addition," the lawyer continued, turning a page with the same careful motion, "the trust includes a clause addressing any attempt to pressure, coerce, or otherwise influence Mrs. Harper's residence or decision-making regarding the property." This time, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer expectant. It was reactive. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, her attention now fully fixed on the lawyer. "Any such actions," he said, his voice steady, "may result in the reduction or reassignment of certain beneficiary interests as outlined in the trust." I did not look at them immediately. I kept my gaze forward, allowing the words to move through the room without interference, without interpretation, because they did not require it. They were complete on their own. I could feel the shift now, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, like a structure adjusting under a new weight. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture changing just enough to signal that something in her understanding had been altered. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, her tone still composed but no longer entirely smooth. "We were under the impression that the house would pass directly to Daniel." The lawyer met her statement with the same calm acknowledgement he had offered everything else. "The house is part of the trust," he replied. "And while Daniel Harper is a named beneficiary, his interest is subject to the conditions set forth by the trust, including Mrs. Harper's residential rights." Daniel finally looked up, his expression no longer neutral, something uncertain, something unsettled beginning to take shape. "So you are saying she cannot be asked to leave?" he said, his voice quieter than I remembered, but clearer now, as if he needed the answer to be precise. "That is correct," the lawyer said simply. "Mrs. Harper cannot be removed from the property under any circumstance that violates the terms of the trust." The room fell quiet again, but this time the quiet carried a different quality. It was no longer controlled by expectation, it was shaped by realization. I turned my gaze toward them then, not sharply, not with confrontation, but with the same calm steadiness I had carried into the room. Vanessa met my eyes, and for the first time, there was no immediate response in her expression, no adjustment, no quick calculation, just a brief, unguarded pause. Daniel looked between us, his hands no longer still, his fingers shifting slightly as if searching for something to hold on to, something familiar, but there was nothing in that moment that could return things to what they had believed. The lawyer continued, outlining the remaining details, the structure of the assets, the distribution schedule, the additional provisions Thomas had included, but the focus of the room had already shifted. Everything now moved around that single point of understanding, that the foundation they had been standing on was not what they thought it was. I remained where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands resting lightly in my lap, because there was nothing I needed to add, nothing I needed to clarify. The truth had been placed in front of them exactly as it was meant to be, without force, without emotion, without the need for defense. And as the lawyer closed the folder with a soft, final motion, the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete, filled with everything that had just been understood, even if it had not yet been fully accepted. No one spoke for several seconds after the lawyer finished, the kind of silence that does not invite conversation, but instead forces recognition, and I could see it settling over them in different ways. Vanessa sat very still, her posture unchanged but no longer confident, her hands resting lightly on the table as if she were holding herself in place, while Daniel shifted again, his shoulders slightly drawn in, his gaze moving between the documents and the space in front of him as though he were trying to reconcile what he had just heard with what he had believed only moments before. I remained where I was, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was no need to rush into that space. The truth had already done what it needed to do, and anything I added too quickly would only disrupt the clarity that had just been established. The lawyer gathered his papers slowly, aligning them with the same care he had shown throughout the meeting, and then he looked at each of us in turn, his expression neutral, his role complete. "If there are no further questions, this concludes the formal review," he said, his voice steady. Vanessa inhaled softly, as if preparing to speak, and then exhaled just as quietly, her eyes shifting briefly toward Daniel before returning to the table. "We will need some time to go over this," she said finally, her tone controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried before. The lawyer nodded once, acknowledging her without adding anything more. Daniel looked up then, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the meeting began, and there was something there I had not seen in days. Not clarity, not yet, but a recognition that something had been misunderstood. "Mom," he said, the word hesitant, unfamiliar in the way it left his mouth, as if he was unsure whether it still carried the same meaning. I held his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a steadiness that did not invite avoidance, and for a moment, he seemed to search for something else to say, something that might bridge the distance that had formed, but nothing came. Vanessa turned slightly toward him, her expression tightening for just a second before smoothing again. "We should discuss this later," she said quietly, her voice low enough that it might have passed as a suggestion rather than a directive. But the effect was the same. Daniel nodded, almost automatically, and that small movement told me more than anything else could have, not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar, the same quiet agreement I had seen before, the same choice to follow rather than question. I stood then, slowly, smoothing the front of my cardigan in the same small, deliberate gesture I had made the night I left the house, and the movement drew their attention back to me, not because it was sudden, but because it marked a shift, not in the room, but in how I occupied it. I reached for my bag, lifting it with ease, and then I looked at them both, not to confront, not to challenge, but to acknowledge what had now been made clear. "I will be returning home this afternoon," I said, my voice calm, even, without emphasis, the words simple, but carrying the weight of something that no longer needed explanation. Vanessa's eyes flickered again, that brief moment of recalibration returning. "We can talk about arrangements," she began, her tone careful, measured, but I shook my head slightly, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to indicate that there was nothing to negotiate. "There is nothing to arrange," I said, maintaining the same steady tone. Daniel looked at me again, more directly this time, and I saw the uncertainty deepen, the realization not yet complete, but no longer avoidable. I did not leave because I had nowhere else to go. I continued, not raising my voice, not adding emotion, just placing the truth where it belonged. "I left because you both asked me to." The words did not carry accusation, but they did not need to. They simply existed, clear and unchanged, and for a moment, Daniel's expression shifted, something like regret moving through it before he could contain it. Vanessa remained still, her posture controlled, but the space around her no longer held the same certainty. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, and took a step toward the door, not hurried, not hesitant, just moving forward in the same measured way I had carried myself since the beginning. If you have questions about the house, I added, pausing briefly, you can speak with the lawyer. I did not wait for a response, not because I did not expect one, but because I understood that whatever they might say now would come from a place that had not yet fully settled, and I had no need to engage with that uncertainty. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the air outside the room feeling lighter, not because anything had been resolved in the way people often expect, but because everything had been clarified. I walked toward the exit with the same steady pace, my footsteps quiet against the floor, and as I reached the front doors and stepped outside, the afternoon light greeted me with a softness that felt almost familiar. I paused for a moment, not to look back, but to take in the simple fact of where I was standing, not removed, not displaced, but exactly where I needed to be. And as I walked toward my car, the same sense of calm that had carried me through the past days settled into something even more certain. I was not returning to reclaim anything. I was returning to what had always been mine, and this time, there would be no question about it.